I still remember the moment everything changed, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't dramatic at first, nothing about it felt like the kind of moment that would split life into a before and after. It was just an ordinary evening, the kind I had lived through 100 times before, the kind I thought I understood completely. I went to her place after work without telling her. I thought it would be a nice surprise. I had done things like that before, small gestures that used to make her smile. I remember feeling light as I walked up, carrying nothing but the expectation of seeing her face brighten when she saw me. The door wasn't fully closed. Voices came from inside. She was talking to her best friend. They sounded relaxed, even cheerful, and for a second I smiled because it felt like I was walking into something warm and familiar. Then I heard my name. I stopped immediately. Not because I expected anything bad, but because something in her tone felt unfamiliar. I stayed outside without entering, telling myself I would announce myself in a moment. But I didn't move. What I heard next slowly erased the comfort I had walked in with. She was talking about me in a way that didn't match anything I believed about us. At first, it sounded like casual complaints, the kind anyone might make when venting. I tried to hold onto that explanation, because it was easier than considering anything else. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that this wasn't just frustration being released. There was amusement in her voice. Not affection disguised as humor, but something sharper. She was describing me as if I was predictable in a boring way, as if the things I thought made me thoughtful were actually things she found unintentionally laughable. My habits, my efforts, even the way I expressed care, were being reduced into something she and her friend could laugh about together. I remember standing completely still, feeling as though I had stepped out of my own life and was watching it from somewhere slightly above it. I kept waiting for something to soften what I was hearing, for a correction or a change in tone that would make it less real. It never came. As the conversation continued, it became more difficult to convince myself that this was just harmless joking. There was a sense of ease in the way she spoke, as if she had said these things before in other moments I was never meant to hear. That thought made my stomach tighten in a way I had never experienced before. What hurt most was not a single sentence or detail. It was the consistency of it, the way it felt like a version of me existed in her mind that I had never been allowed to see. A version that was smaller, less impressive, and easier to laugh at. At some point I realized I had been outside the door for too long. I moved away without making a sound. I didn't want to be discovered standing there, and I didn't know what I would say if I stayed. My body felt strangely detached, like it was following instructions without my permission. Outside, everything looked normal. People walked past. Cars moved. Life continued without hesitation. That contrast made what I had just heard feel even more unreal, like it belonged in a different version of the world. I didn't go back immediately. I wandered for a while without direction, trying to organize my thoughts, but nothing would settle. Everything I thought I knew about how she saw me had shifted into something uncertain and unfamiliar. When I finally saw her later, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I needed time to understand what I had heard before confronting it, or maybe I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it final. She behaved completely normally, as if the world between us hadn't changed shape. That normality made everything worse. It forced me to question whether I had misunderstood, whether I had exaggerated it in my mind. But every time I tried to soften it, I remembered the tone, the ease, the laughter that followed words I had never been meant to hear. Over the next few days I found myself observing her differently. Not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. I started noticing small things I had never paid attention to before, the way she sometimes spoke about people with a kind of detached amusement, the way her tone shifted when she was relaxed versus when she was being careful. None of it fully matched the version of her I had been holding onto. And slowly, that version began to feel less real. I did not confront her immediately. I carried it with me, letting it sit between us like something invisible but heavy. Every interaction felt slightly altered, even when nothing obvious changed. I kept waiting for clarity, but instead I found myself sinking deeper into uncertainty. When I eventually brought it up, I wasn't angry in the way I thought I would be. I was tired in a way that made anger feel distant. She explained it as jokes, as normal friend talk, as something not meant to be taken seriously. But I could not separate the tone I had heard from the explanation being given. What stayed with me was not only what was said, but how easily it was said. That ease revealed something I could not ignore anymore. It suggested that what I overheard was not an exception, but a glimpse of something that already existed. After that, everything between us felt slightly misaligned. Conversations continued, routines continued, but something essential had shifted. I found myself unable to return to the version of the relationship I had believed in before that night. The hardest part was not the realization itself, but accepting that I had been seeing something incomplete for a long time without knowing it. And once that awareness settled in, it changed the way I looked at everything that came after it. After that conversation, nothing immediately fell apart, but nothing felt whole either. Life didn't give me a clear ending, no dramatic separation, no clean break that would make it easier to process. Instead, everything continued in a strangely normal way, as if the surface of things had decided to stay intact even while something underneath had already cracked. I started noticing how I behaved around her. I became quieter without planning to. My reactions slowed down. Even my laughter felt delayed, like it had to pass through something before reaching the outside. She didn't seem to notice at first, or maybe she did and chose not to say anything. That uncertainty itself began to weigh on me. There were moments when I almost convinced myself that I had overreacted. That maybe what I overheard was just an unfortunate snapshot of a conversation that didn't represent anything deeper. But those moments never lasted long. They always collapsed under the memory of how natural her voice had sounded when she spoke about me that way. There had been no hesitation, no discomfort, no sign that she was crossing a line she might regret. That realization stayed with me more than anything else. I began to feel like I was living next to someone I was still trying to understand from a distance I couldn't close anymore. We still shared space, still shared time, but something essential had shifted. It was no longer about what she did in front of me. It was about what existed when I wasn't supposed to be present. I tried to focus on the good moments. There were still some. She still smiled at me sometimes in a way that looked real enough. She still asked about my day. She still reached for me without thinking. But even those moments started to feel layered, as if I was now seeing them through a second meaning I couldn't unsee. The worst part was how normal everything looked from the outside. If someone else had observed us, they would not have noticed anything wrong. That made me question my own perception constantly. I began to wonder if this was what emotional distance felt like, not separation, but silent reinterpretation of everything you once trusted. At night, when things were quiet, I replayed that moment over and over again. Not just the words, but the tone, the ease, the laughter that followed them. I tried to understand how someone could shift between affection and ridicule so effortlessly. I wondered if I had missed signs before, small cracks I had chosen not to see because I wanted to believe in the version of her I had built in my mind. Slowly, I started to accept something I didn't want to admit. The version of her I loved and the version of her I overheard were not two separate people. They were the same person seen from different angles, and I had only ever been allowed to see one of them until that night. That thought changed the way I understood everything we had shared. I became more distant without intending to. Not cold, not angry, just absent in a way I couldn't fully control. She eventually noticed. There were questions, small attempts to understand what had changed. But I couldn't explain it in a way that felt complete. How do you explain that the foundation of your perception has shifted without sounding like you are accusing someone of being something they don't recognize themselves? So, I stayed quiet more often than I spoke. And in that silence, I started to understand something uncomfortable about myself as well. I realized how much of my identity in that relationship had been built on being seen a certain way. Being appreciated, being valued, being understood. Once that perception was damaged, I didn't just lose trust in her. I lost trust in the version of myself that existed inside her story. Eventually, Distance became inevitable, even without a single defining moment of separation. We still existed in each other's lives, but the connection had changed shape. It no longer felt like something growing. It felt like something slowly unwinding, thread by thread, without urgency. What stayed with me most was not resentment, but clarity. Painful clarity. The kind that doesn't explode but settles quietly and refuses to leave. I stopped asking myself whether I misunderstood what I heard. Instead, I started accepting that hearing it had shown me something I was never meant to see, but needed to see anyway. And even now, long after that night, I still remember standing outside that door, realizing that sometimes the most important truths in life are not spoken to you directly. Sometimes you discover them by accident, in the moments you were never supposed to witness, and once you do, nothing can return to the way it was before. After a while, I stopped waiting for things to go back to normal. That expectation had been quietly keeping me stuck, like I was just paused in a version of life that would eventually resume if I waited long enough. But nothing resumed. Nothing reset. The relationship simply continued in its altered form, and I began to understand that this altered version was the real one, not the one I had been holding onto before. There was a strange kind of grief in that realization. Not the kind that arrives loudly, but the kind that spreads slowly and quietly until you notice it has already taken up most of the space inside you. I wasn't only losing her as I thought I knew her. I was also losing the version of myself that had felt secure in that relationship. I started to observe my own thoughts more carefully. I noticed how often I replayed conversations, how I searched for hidden meanings in simple words, how I questioned sincerity even in moments that were meant to be light. It wasn't just about her anymore. Something inside me had shifted into a state of constant interpretation, as if nothing could be taken at face value again. That was the part I didn't expect. The damage wasn't limited to trust in one person. It spread outward, changing how I related to everything around me. I became more cautious, more reserved, less willing to assume warmth was always genuine just because it looked like it. There were still moments with her that felt familiar. Moments where I almost forgot everything and slipped back into old patterns of comfort. But those moments always ended with a quiet return of awareness, like surfacing from water and remembering you were holding your breath the entire time. We stayed in each other's lives longer than I thought we would. Not because things were good, but because endings are rarely as clean as we imagine them will be. There were unfinished conversations that never fully resolved, emotions that didn't know where to go, habits that didn't disappear just because understanding had changed. But over time, even that began to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually becoming less necessary. The urgency to fix, to understand, to confront, all of it slowly lost its intensity. What remained was distance that didn't need to be announced. I found myself spending more time alone without feeling as though I was missing something. That was new. Before, solitude used to feel like absence. Now it felt more like space. Space to think without distortion, space to breathe without interpretation, space to exist without constantly measuring how I was being perceived. Sometimes I would still think about that night, not with anger anymore, and not even with sadness most of the time. More like a reference point. A moment my life had quietly pivoted around without warning. What stayed with me was the awareness that people are not fixed in the way we sometimes need them to be. They exist differently in different contexts. There is the version they show you, the version they show others, and sometimes a version that only appears when they believe no one important is listening. I had accidentally stepped into that hidden space, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Eventually, even her presence in my daily thoughts began to reduce. Not because I forced it, but because time naturally stripped away urgency. What once felt like confusion softened into understanding, and what once felt like pain turned into something quieter, less demanding of attention. I stopped asking why it happened. That question used to feel essential, as if an answer would restore something lost. But there is no answer that restores what perception destroys. There is only acceptance that something was revealed too early, and that revelation cannot be reversed. Looking back now, I don't think the most painful part was what she said. It was realizing how easily reality can exist in layers, and how long someone can live inside only one of those layers without knowing there is more beneath it. And maybe the hardest truth of all is that the moment I heard her, I didn't just discover what she thought about me. I discovered how fragile the version of love I believed in really was when it was never meant to be fully seen. After everything settled, I began to understand that the story didn't end when I walked away from her. It ended much earlier, in that quiet space outside the door, where I first heard a version of reality I was never meant to hear. Everything after that was just the slow unfolding of what had already been decided in that moment. Life, however, didn't suddenly become clear or simple. It became quieter in some ways, but also more thoughtful. I started paying attention to patterns I used to ignore. The way people choose words carefully when they want to be kind, and how differently those same words can sound when they are spoken without awareness of being overheard. I became more aware of how much of human connection is performance layered over sincerity, and how often both exist at the same time without canceling each other out. There were days when I felt completely detached from everything that had happened, as if it belonged to someone else's memory. On those days, I could think about her without emotional weight, almost like reviewing a past chapter of a book I had already finished reading. But there were also days when the memory returned with full clarity, not as pain exactly, but as a reminder of how quickly perception can collapse. What surprised me most was how the experience reshaped the way I understood myself. I had always believed I was someone who could sense sincerity easily, someone who trusted carefully but confidently once trust was given. That belief didn't survive what I heard. Instead, I found myself questioning not only others, but also my own tendency to build emotional certainty too quickly. I started to see how much of my emotional world had been built on assumptions I never tested, not just about her, but about relationships in general. I had believed that what was expressed in private moments was the most accurate reflection of truth. But that night showed me that private moments can also contain the most unfiltered distortions, moments where people are not presenting themselves, but releasing whatever they carry without thinking about how it will be received. Over time, the intensity of the memory softened, but it never disappeared completely. It became something I could look at without falling into it. A fixed point in my past that no longer pulled me backward, but still shaped how I moved forward. I stopped trying to assign blame in a simple way. It wasn't about making her into someone entirely cruel, nor was it about pretending I misunderstood everything. The truth was more complicated than either extreme. She had been both the person I loved and someone capable of speaking about me in a way that stripped away the softness I believed existed between us. Those two realities coexisted, and I had to learn to hold both without forcing them to cancel each other out. Eventually, even the emotional charge on the memory faded enough that I could think about it without feeling destabilized. What remained was understanding. Not forgiveness in a dramatic sense, and not bitterness either, but something quieter. An awareness that people reveal different versions of themselves depending on context, and that love does not guarantee access to all of those versions. There are still moments when I think about how close I came to never knowing. How easily I could have stayed inside a version of the relationship that felt complete, without ever realizing there was another layer underneath it. That thought doesn't hurt anymore, but it stays with me as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be. In the end, what I lost wasn't just a relationship. I lost an illusion of stability, and in losing it, I gained something more uncomfortable but more honest. I gained the understanding that knowing someone is never as complete as it feels in the moment, and that sometimes, the truth arrives not through conversation or confession, but through accident, silence, and unintended listening, and once that kind of truth enters your life, it doesn't ask permission to stay.